Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast, a discussion of important structures of angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants. And flowering plants are a very broad category of plants. All broadleaf plants that you can possibly imagine, like oaks and maples and beech and elm and birch. These are all examples of angiosperms, flowering plants, as well as traditional flowers that you might think of, like tulips or daffodils or some spring ephemeral flowers like trout lily or wild ginger, which are both in bloom right now. But also grasses. For example, your front lawn, the grass in your front lawn is a flowering plant. You don't often see the grass flower because you probably mow your lawn before it flowers and fruits. Okay, but all flowering plants produce a flower, and then that flower turns into a fruit. And you were looking at that in class today. Or I guess not today. I'm actually recording the screencast in advance for Rachel because she said she had a busy week and she wanted to get started early. So I'm recording this before you've done it in class. However, we've looked at pictures of a tomato plant, the flower, and the transition to a fruit. So we're going to be talking about the general parts of a flower and fruit, and you're going to see a little bit about what components of the flower become the components of the fruit. Okay, so to start out, number one, this structure down here is called a sepal. Depending on the type of flower, I guess I don't need to do exclamation marks. It's not that exciting, sepals. Well, sepals are very exciting. The sepal is a protective cover over the flower that unfurls when the flower is going to bloom. Depending on the species, the sepal might cover up the flower overnight and then open up in the morning, or vice versa. Some plants only flower at night if their pollinators are bats or moths. But the sepal is a kind of modified leaf. It can look more like a petal or more like a leaf depending on the plant that it's part of. Okay, number two is pretty obvious. You all probably know this part of the flower, but number two is the petals. Number three, we're getting to the quote unquote male part of the flower. So this component right here is called the anther. And the anther sits on this stalk-like component right here, which is called the filament. And the anther produces grains of pollen, which will be either carried by the wind or will be carried by a pollinator animal, and it will fertilize another flower. Okay, so together, the pollen and the anther and the filament, let me see, this flower has two of them. They all make up the male structure of the plant. Probably should have done the vertical line first, which is called the stamen. But we're doing a little gender bending just to be confusing here. We're going to color this in pink. Okay, so the filament, anther, and pollen all make up the male component of the flower, which is the stamen. Okay, next up, we have structure number 5. This is also a tube-like structure. The filaments, depending on the structure, would be, I actually don't know if they're hollow or solid, but I do know that the style is always a tube, so it's going to be hollow in the center here. So this is called the style. And at the base of the style is structure number 6, which is the ovary. And the ovary holds the structure called the ovule. And the ovule contains an egg. Now, depending on the species, there might just be one ovule inside. So, for example, an oak tree flower is just going to have one ovule inside the ovary, but some other plants will have multiple ovules inside the ovary, like an apple tree, for example, will have multiple ovules. Okay, so these things, in conjunction with the structure up here, which is called the stigma, these all make up the female part of the flower. So the stigma is often a little bit sticky. And when pollen grains land on the stigma, they get stuck there. And then they actually grow what's called a pollen tube down the length of the style, and they fertilize the egg contained within the ovule. So these 3 things, oh, no, this is 4, math, the style, the ovary, and the ovule, plus the stigma, all make up the carpel. Oops, I think I spelled that wrong. P-C-A-R-P-E-L, which is the female structure of the flower. Okay, so that is the flower. We've just labeled everything on the flower. Now, if you check out the fruit over here, so over time, the flower is fertilized. The ovule is fertilized by a grain of pollen, and it becomes, okay, wait, actually before I get there, let's stay in touch with the structures we've already named. So we can see number 6 is here, and it is also over here. This now is the flesh of the fruit. So if this is a peach, for example, this would be the flesh of the peach. But notice we labeled number 6 over here as the ovary. So next time you take a big bite of your most favorite fruit, know that you are eating plant ovary. You're welcome. Okay, so we can color this in blue because the ovary has transitioned into becoming the flesh of the fruit. And number 10 is the seed coat. Oops, that's spelled wrong. S-E-E-D. I don't know why I keep putting exclamation marks. I'm very excited about the structure of flowers and fruits. Okay, so number 10 is the seed coat. Often seeds are coated in a tough structure that prevents their digestion and houses inside of them what's called endosperm and embryo, which is, I guess we can put an exclamation point next to this one, is the baby plant. So when the pollen came down and fertilized the ovule, it created, that event created an embryo, which is the tiny baby plant contained within the seed. In addition, it creates the structure called the endosperm, which is often very rich in fat and in protein. So when you think of eating nuts, they're very rich in fat and protein. And this is going to be fuel for the developing embryo when it germinates, because often seeds fall into the soil or are defecated into the soil by an animal that has eaten this fruit. So a fruit is actually a technique of a plant in order to disseminate its seeds. And so in order to get this little baby plant far away from the original plant, it is eaten by an animal and then defecated out somewhere else in a nice little package of fertilizer. And then it's going to germinate when it is under the right conditions. For some plants, the trigger would be temperature and water. For others, it might be fire. And that is going to have the embryo germinate and sprout, and then it's going to use the endosperm as it fuels its early life before it starts to do a bunch of photosynthesis. Okay, the last thing we see here is number 2, which are the old crunchy petals of the flower, which kind of wither often around the fruit. And then the sepal also usually dries up and gets crunchy as well. So there it is, the transition from flowers to fruit. And as we enter spring here, I highly encourage you to check out a flowering plant in your yard or somewhere around school and just check back in on it once a week for a while, and you'll start to see the flowers bloom and then wither and the fruit starts to develop. Okay, that's all.